Under a fog thick enough to swallow headlights whole, a car crawled toward iron gates guarded by men who reeked of danger and old blood. Behind the wheel sat a twin wearing guilt like cheap cologne, driving his own blood toward the one alpha an entire city crossed the street to avoid. He told himself it was survival. He told himself the debt would die quietly behind those gates, along with the brother he was about to abandon there. What he never imagined was that the monster he fed his own twin to would months later force him to his knees, begging for the one thing money could never buy back. What really happened behind those gates that turned a predator into someone else's mercy? Pour yourself something warm and settle in, because this is the story of Kieran Hale, the twin who was sold like collateral and somehow walked away holding all the power. If you have ever had someone close to you mistake your patience for weakness, let us know in the comments, because Kieran is about to make that mistake very expensive. Betrayal never announces itself with a blade at your throat. It comes wearing your own face, smiling gently, and it pushes you into the dark before you even feel the hand on your back. My identical twin traded my life to erase his debts. He signed me over to an alpha the entire city crossed the street to avoid, and he told himself I would be chewed up and spat out by morning. He thought he'd won. What he never understood was that the monster he fed me to was exactly the kind of man I had spent my whole life waiting for. In our world, pack was the language everyone still used for the old bonds. Blood, debt, obligation, the invisible rules omegas and alphas had lived by for generations. The Voss Syndicate was simply what happened when a pack stopped pretending those rules were about family and admitted they were about power instead. Dominic Voss ran both at once, seamlessly, and that was precisely what made him so feared. Loyalty is a strange thing when you share a face with someone. You grow up believing the bond between you is unbreakable, that you split a womb, split a bedroom, split the blame the day the kitchen window shattered. For 23 years, I believed Julian and I were two halves of the same cracked coin. I was wrong. He was the coin. I was just the pocket he finally burned a hole through. The inside of Julian's rusted sedan reeked of panic. That sour, acrid note an omega gives off when the body knows something the mind is still refusing to admit. Julian's scent was usually spun sugar and vanilla, sweet enough to make alphas stupid. That night, it had curdled into something closer to scorched caramel and cheap fear. His knuckles had gone bone-white on the wheel. His eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds, as if the past might be gaining on us. I stared out the passenger window instead, watching the last smear of city light dissolve into the black tree line of the northern hills. "You're doing the right thing, Kieran." It was the 5th time he'd said it since we'd locked the door of our cramped 2-bedroom, for what I already suspected was the last time. The repetition wasn't for my benefit. It was a man trying to talk his own conscience back into its cage. "They would have killed me," Julian said when I didn't answer. "You know that, right? They'd have put a bullet in me and left me for the river." He owed $2.3 million. $2.3 million, a number so absurd it barely registered as real currency, more like something you'd read in a headline about someone else's ruin. I still didn't fully understand how he'd built a debt that size. Underground card rooms. Borrowing against a family pack name we barely had the right to use. Promising collateral that didn't exist to men who did. He'd gambled that his pretty face and honeyed scent would be armor enough against the Voss Syndicate. It wasn't. "I know," I said. My voice came out hollow, stripped of whatever fight I'd once carried in it. "Dominic Voss doesn't care which twin shows up." Julian pressed on, talking too fast now, the way he always did when he was trying to outrun his own guilt. "The contract just says a Hail Omega. That's the whole requirement. A guardianship transfer to settle the ledger. You keep your head down, you do what you're told, you serve the 5 years, and then you're free. 6 months, tops, and I'll have the rest together. I swear it, Kieran." I turned my head, slow, and looked at my twin properly for what I already suspected might be the last time in a long while. We wore the same black hair, the same pale skin, the same sharp jaw, but where Julian had spent years cultivating an aura of delicate, breakable prettiness, I had built myself into something closer to a barricade, oversized hoodies to hide my frame. Industrial-grade suppressants that choked my scent down to something dusty and forgettable. I stocked shelves at a freight warehouse while Julian floated through society mixers on borrowed charm, and in the end, I was the one being sent to settle his tab. The man collecting it was Dominic Voss, You didn't need to know the first thing about pack politics to know that name. Voss was the kind of ghost story whispered in boardrooms and back alleys alike, cold, surgical, an alpha who was said to have torn his own uncle's throat out with his bare hands at 20 years old to take the syndicate for himself. The stories painted a man who broke omegas for sport and discarded them the moment they stopped being useful, or stopped crying, whichever came first. I thought, unbidden, of the window we'd broken when we were 9, the one that had started this whole habit of shared blame. Julian had thrown the ball. I was the one who'd been standing closer when our mother came running, and somewhere in the half-second it took her to demand an answer, I'd opened my mouth and said it was me before Julian could even flinch. It became a pattern neither of us ever named out loud. He broke things. I absorbed the cost. For years I told myself that was simply what twins did for each other, that the debt ran both directions, even if I could never quite remember a time it had run toward me. Sitting in that car, watching the fog swallow the road, I finally let myself admit what I'd always known and never said. It had never run both directions. It had only ever run one way, and I'd spent 23 years mistaking the shape of my own exploitation for love. 5 years, I repeated, and the words tasted like ash going down. It'll go fast, Julian said, flashing a smile that trembled at the edges. I'll get the money together. I promise you, Kieran. It was a lie. We both knew it. The car lurched as we turned off the highway onto a private, unpaved road, headlights slicing through fog thick enough to chew, until massive iron gates rose up out of the dark like something built to swallow the sky. 2 men in heavy coats stood sentry at the entrance. Even through the glass, I could feel the oppressive weight of their alpha pheromones pressing against the windshield. Julian killed the engine. He didn't look at me. He kept his eyes fixed on the wheel, his breathing shallow and fast. Get out, he whispered. I reached for the door handle. No tearful goodbye, no last hug. I didn't even have a bag. Julian hadn't given me the time to pack one. I stepped out into air, still holding the last damp heat of late summer, gravel crunching under boots that had seen better years. One of the guards approached, built like something designed to move freight, his face a carefully blank wall. He held a tablet in one hand. You're the Hale collateral, he said. It wasn't phrased as a question, and it wasn't my name, a detail I'd remember later, once I understood exactly how much it should have mattered. Yes. He glanced past me at the car, and then back, and something in his expression made it clear he already knew, and didn't care, that the man behind the wheel wasn't the one who'd been sold. The ledger demanded a body. I was the body provided. He tapped the tablet screen. Hold out your wrist. I pushed up my sleeve. He clamped a thick metal band around it, and it clicked shut with a sound that felt disturbingly final, a digital tracker and a brand, all in one. Behind me, the engine sputtered back to life. I didn't turn around as the tires spat gravel and Julian's taillights shrank into the fog. I didn't watch my brother leave me behind. I just stared at the band on my wrist and let the cold sink all the way into my veins. Walk, the guard said. I walked. The gates closed behind me with a metallic clang that sealed me inside the lion's den for good. The estate wasn't gaudy the way new money liked to be gaudy. There was no gold leaf, no ostentation for its own sake. This was old power, dark wood, vaulted ceilings, corridors so silent they seemed to hum with their own stillness. I was marched through a maze of hallways, my boots squeaking faintly against marble polished to a mirror shine. Every servant and guard we passed kept their eyes fixed on the floor, like looking up cost something they weren't willing to pay. Somewhere behind one of those doors, I thought, was probably a wine cellar bigger than the apartment I'd grown up in. Somewhere else was probably a room built for exactly the kind of punishment the stories about this family liked to dwell on. I didn't know which door led where, and the not knowing was its own kind of pressure, a low hum under my sternum that refused to quiet down no matter how evenly I tried to breathe. The air was climate-controlled to a precise, sterile perfection, and still I found myself shivering. My suppressants were overdue for a dose, and a dull ache had started low in my abdomen, my body quietly losing a war against its own biology. The guard stopped in front of a set of heavy mahogany doors and knocked once, firm. Enter. The voice from inside was quiet. It didn't need to be loud. It vibrated through the wood like something that had never once had to repeat itself. The doors opened, and I was pushed inside. I stumbled, caught myself on the edge of an antique rug, and looked up into an office that seemed to stretch on forever, bookshelves climbing to the ceiling, a fire cracking lazily in a stone hearth big enough to stand in. Behind a heavy oak desk sat Dominic Voss. I braced for a monster. I expected scarring, a snarl, something visibly wrong with him to match the stories. Instead, I saw a man who looked, more than anything, exhausted. Dark hair, neatly trimmed, shot through with premature silver at the temples. A jaw sharp enough to cut glass, shadowed with the beginnings of stubble. A crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow, forearms corded with a kind of lean, functional muscle that had nothing to do with a gym. He was reading through a stack of paperwork, a fountain pen moving in a slow, steady rhythm across the page, and he didn't look up. He let the silence stretch, tight and uncomfortable, clearly testing to see if I would fidget. I didn't drop my eyes either. If he wanted to break me, he could do the work himself. I wasn't going to hand him the hammer. Finally, he set the pen down, leaned back, and steepled his fingers, fixing me with a stare that was pale gray, cold, and unnervingly intelligent. The moment his eyes locked on mine, his scent hit me. Not the aggressive, choking dominance I'd braced for from a debt collector, but something like burnt cedar and deep winter frost. Sharp, clean, strangely grounding. Something buried deep under years of chemical suppression stirred inside me, my inner omega giving an unmistakable, unwelcome purr of approval. I gritted my teeth and dug my nails into my palms until the instinct went quiet again. "You don't smell like fear," Dominic said. His tone was clinical, almost curious. "I don't have the energy for it," I answered. His left eyebrow ticked upward, the faintest flicker of surprise. He picked up a leather folder from the desk and opened it. "Julian Hale," he read aloud, voice smooth and detached. 23, unmated omega, 2.3 million in debt, accrued through unsanctioned borrowing against my subordinates, offered a family member as collateral to prevent liquidation of remaining assets. He glanced up. "Is that summary accurate?" "Accurate enough," I lied. My voice didn't shake. I'd spent a lifetime covering for Julian. This was just the final permanent version of it. Dominic stood. He was taller than I'd braced for, and he crossed the room with a predatory ease that made my whole body lock up. My heart slammed against my ribs like something trying to claw its way out. Here it comes, I thought. He stopped less than 2 feet away, close enough that I could see the fine lines of exhaustion carved around his eyes. He leaned in slightly, breathing in, searching for my scent and finding almost nothing. He frowned. "You smell like chalk and stale coffee. Are you unwell?" "I take suppressants," I said, chin level. "Why?" "Because the world's full of alphas who think with their glands instead of their brains." The silence that followed felt like the drop before a fall. I braced for a backhand. "You didn't speak to an alpha like that, let alone the head of the Voss syndicate. You lowered your eyes. You bared your throat. Instead, a short, breathy sound escaped him. It took me a full second to place it as a laugh. "Practical," he murmured and stepped back, putting distance between us. The sudden absence of his heat left me strangely, stupidly cold. "Your brother, or rather you, made quite a mess of my ledgers. I don't run a charity, Mr. Hale. I run a business. When a debt goes unpaid, I collect what's owed." "Understood," I said. "Where do you want me to scrub the floors?" He paused on his way back to the desk, glancing over his shoulder, genuinely thrown. "Scrub the floors? I assume that's what I'm here for, unless you'd prefer another form of payment." I kept my voice flat, refusing to show how badly the implication frightened me. "I'm not exactly prime breeding stock." Manual labor seemed the obvious default. The amusement drained out of his face, replaced by something harder, more calculating. "Did you read the contract you signed?" "I didn't sign it. Julian did. But I know the terms. 5 years of service." "The contract is a mating agreement," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "You are not here to be staff. You are here to be my mate. By the end of the month, you will carry my mark. That was the price of sparing your life." The floor seemed to tilt. Julian had never said the word mating. He'd called it a guardianship transfer. A servant's contract. My breath caught before I could stop it, and something carefully built in my chest began to crack. Mating wasn't a job you clocked out of. It was permanent. It rewired you. Dominic watched the realization land on my face, and something in his own expression softened, just a fraction. Not pity, something closer to recognition. "You'll have a suite in the East Wing," he said, returning to his chair, entirely without triumph, like a man filing paperwork rather than claiming a prize. "You'll be provided for. Your debt is cleared. You're forbidden from leaving the estate without an escort. We'll discuss the physical terms of the contract once you've settled. Go." My guard will show you to your rooms." He dismissed me just like that. I turned and walked out on legs I couldn't quite feel. I was a prisoner. I'd been sold to a monster. And yet, as I followed the guard down the hall, the only thing my mind could hold on to was the scent of winter frost, and the unsettling certainty that the monster hadn't wanted to hurt me at all. The gilded cage was exactly that. Gilded. My suite in the East Wing was bigger than the entire apartment Julian and I had shared. A king bed draped in heavy dark linen, a private bath with a clawfoot tub, a balcony overlooking gardens manicured within an inch of their lives. The closet was already filled with clothes in exactly my size: cashmere, tailored slacks, heavy knit sweaters. Not a single oversized hoodie anywhere in sight. It felt like a trap dressed up as a gift. For the first 4 days, I barely left the room. Meals arrived courtesy of a quiet, unreadable beta housekeeper named Martha, who never pried. She simply set down trays of roasted meat and fresh vegetables and rich desserts and left again. I ate sparingly, waiting for the bill I was sure would come due. Men like Dominic Voss didn't hand out kindness for free. There was always a cost. I spent those 4 days cataloging every possible motive behind the silence, turning it over the way I used to turn over a delivery manifest, looking for the discrepancy that would tell me what was actually going on. Maybe he was letting me settle before the real terms came out. Maybe the kindness was a leash, slack now so it could be yanked tighter later. Maybe, and this was the theory I trusted least, because it required believing something good about a man the entire city called a monster. Maybe there was no angle at all. I didn't know how to sit with that possibility. 23 years of watching Julian charm his way into rooms and out of consequences had taught me that people were rarely as simple as they presented themselves, and I wasn't ready to extend Dominic Voss the benefit of a doubt I'd never once extended my own brother. By the 5th day, the silence had started to feel like a physical weight. I was used to 12-hour shifts on my feet, the roar of forklifts, the constant motion of a warehouse floor. The crushing quiet of the estate was making my skin crawl. Worse, my suppressants had run completely dry. Julian hadn't packed my pills. Of course he hadn't. And I could feel my real scent starting to surface, a sharp mix of bruised blackberries and damp earth, tangled up with the first low hum of an approaching heat cycle. I needed to move. I needed to do something with my hands. I left the suite a little after midnight. The corridors were lit low by wall sconces, and I wandered without any real direction until I found myself at the bottom of a grand staircase and into a kitchen the size of a small restaurant, lit only by moonlight through tall windows. I dug through the industrial fridges until I found a rag and a bottle of heavy-duty cleaner. If I couldn't sleep, I could at least be useful. It was the only coping mechanism I had left that still worked. I dropped to my knees and started scrubbing the baseboards, letting the sharp chemical burn mask the sweetness rising off my own skin, scrubbing until my knuckles ached and my breath came in short, hard gasps. For one brief, shining moment, I wasn't an Omega who'd been sold to a warlord. I was just a guy cleaning a floor. "What the hell are you doing?" I froze. Turned my head. Dominic stood in the doorway in dark sweatpants and a plain gray t-shirt that clung to a chest I had no business noticing, his hair messy over his forehead. He looked less like a mafia boss and more like a man who'd woken up wanting a glass of water. His eyes traveled from the rag in my hand to the bucket of soapy water to my face, and I scrambled upright, panic flaring hot and sudden in my chest. I was out of my room. I was touching things that weren't mine to touch. In the pack circles I'd grown up around, that alone was punishable. "I couldn't sleep," I blurted, stepping back until my spine hit the counter. "I was just cleaning the floor. It's 2 a.m, I know. He crossed the room and the scent of burnt cedar spiked, heavy and dominant, swallowing the chemical bite of the cleaner whole. I dropped my chin on reflex, baring my throat, a pathetic, deeply carved-in submission response I hated myself for. "I'm sorry, I'll go back to my room." He stopped a few feet away. I waited for the reprimand, for a hand closing around my arm and dragging me toward the door. Instead, I heard him sigh, long and heavy. "Look at me," he said. I lifted my head slowly. His jaw was tight, but there was no anger in his eyes, only a kind of intense, cataloging focus, mapping the tension in my shoulders, the shake in my hands. "Why are you acting like a beaten dog?" he asked, quiet. The question landed harder than a slap would have. It sliced straight through the panic and hit something underneath it I didn't have a ready answer for. He crossed to the sink, instead of pressing further, wetting a clean towel. He didn't hand it to me. He He took my hands in his own and dried them himself, slow and deliberate. His palms were rough, heavily calloused, radiating a heat that felt almost dangerous. I stopped breathing. The gesture was so quietly intimate, so completely at odds with everything I thought I knew about this man, that my brain simply stalled out. "I don't hurt what's mine," Dominic said, voice dropping into something low enough to feel in my sternum. "And I don't expect my mate to be on his hands and knees, scrubbing my floors at 2 in the morning. If you're restless, tell me. If you're unhappy, tell me. But you do not flinch from me. Understood?" I looked up into eyes the color of a winter sky and found nothing performed in them. "Understood," I whispered. He didn't let go of my hands. He stepped in closer instead, his nose grazing the air near my neck, and drew in a slow breath. His whole body went still. "Your scent," he murmured, and something in his voice had gone thick. I panicked, tried to pull back. His grip tightened, not enough to bruise, enough to hold. "My suppressants wore off," I stammered. "I know it's heavy, I'm sorry." "Blackberries," he cut in, eyes flashing with a sudden focused heat. "And earth." He looked down at me, and for the first time since I'd walked through his gates, a crack opened up in his stoic composure, confusion warring with something dangerously close to hunger. "The file on Julian Hale says he smells like vanilla and spun sugar." My blood went cold. He leaned in, lips brushing the shell of my ear. "So tell me, little Omega, who exactly did I buy?" The lie died in my throat before I could form the first syllable. I'd spent years talking my way past floor managers and debt collectors, but looking into Dominic Voss's eyes was like staring down the barrel of something loaded. There was no room left for deception. His aura pressed against the kitchen tiles, rooting my feet to the floor. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Tell me," he said softly. "Kieran," I breathed, the word scraping out of a dry throat. "My name is Kieran." His grip loosened, though he didn't let go entirely. His thumbs stopped their slow drift over my knuckles. The confusion in his eyes shattered into something colder, sharper. He was piecing it together in real time. The missing scent, the oversized clothes, the complete absence of the polish his file must have described. "Julian's twin," he said. It wasn't a question. "Identical," I said, forcing myself to hold his gaze even as every instinct screamed at me to look away. "We look exactly the same until I open my mouth, or until the suppressants wear off. He sold you." The bluntness of it landed like a fist to the ribs. Hearing it said out loud, under the stark kitchen lights of a house worth more than my entire life, stripped away the last threadbare excuse I'd been holding onto for my brother. "He owed you $2.3 million, I said, my voice hardening, the fear draining out and leaving only the tired, familiar cynicism that had kept me upright for 23 years. "He didn't have it. Your men were going to kill him. So he drove me to the gate, handed me over, and left. The contract said a Hail Omega. You got one." Dominic released my hands and stepped back. The air in the room shifted instantly. The calm scent of cedar and frost soured into something jagged, something that smelled like ozone right before a lightning strike. He turned away, dragging a hand down his face, the muscles across his back drawn so tight they looked carved from stone. I braced myself against the counter. This was it. The deception was exposed. The collateral had been switched. Men like Dominic Voss did not tolerate being made fools of. I closed my eyes, waiting for the violence I'd been promised by every rumor about this man. "Martha," Dominic barked, and I jumped. A side door I hadn't even clocked swung open almost immediately, and the housekeeper stepped through, tying a robe at her waist, entirely unbothered by the hour or the aggressive spike in her alpha's scent. "Sir, prepare the south wing," Dominic said, still staring at the marble island, jaw working. "Lock down the perimeter. No one enters or leaves without my direct authorization. Understood." "And the Omega?" He finally turned to look at me, and the full weight of his focus pinned me to the counter. "Stays exactly where he is." Martha nodded once and vanished. I swallowed hard. "If you're going to kill me, do it fast. I'd rather not sit in a basement waiting for it." Dominic let out a short, bitter laugh and closed the distance between us in 2 strides, stopping inches from my face. "Kill you?" he repeated, voice a low, lethal whisper. "You think I'm angry at you? You think you're the one who insulted me tonight?" "You lied to me," I said. "You survived," he corrected sharply. He reached out, and for one terrifying second I thought his hand was going for my throat. Instead, his fingers brushed a stray lock of hair off my forehead, gentle in a way that made no sense against the violence still radiating off him. "Your brother looked me in the eye, signed his own name to a contract describing his own scent, and then sent someone else's body to make good on it. He thought I wouldn't notice the difference. He leaned down, his nose grazing my jaw, and I gasped, my knees going unreliable. He was wrong. He breathed me in like he was drowning, and I was the surface. The angry ozone scent began to thin, replaced by something heavier, unhurried. Vanilla is boring, Kieran. I've never much cared for sweets. My heart hit my ribs hard enough to bruise. You're not sending me back? Sending you back? He pulled away just enough to look at me properly, eyes bright with dark amusement. You are the only real thing that's walked through my doors in a decade. I didn't want the society darling playing at pack politics. I want the survivor who scrubs floors at 2 a.m. because his own mind won't let him rest. He stepped back, putting distance between us, though his eyes never left mine. The contract is valid as far as I'm concerned, he said, voice sliding back into something pragmatic and level. You're under my protection now. That part of the ledger is closed. His tone dropped, sharpening like broken glass. Julian Hale, however, is now guilty of fraud, breach of contract, and is insulting the head of this syndicate. That's an entirely separate debt. I shivered. I knew exactly what that meant. Julian had thought he'd escaped clean. He didn't realize he'd just painted a target on his own back. What are you going to do to him? I'm going to teach him that actions carry consequences, Dominic said, and his smile didn't come anywhere near his eyes. But that's my business, not yours. Your business right now is the fact that you're about to collapse. I frowned. What? Your suppressants, he said quietly, eyes tracking the sudden flush crawling up my throat. They didn't just wear off, Kieran. They crashed. You're heading into a chemically induced heat, and you are not remotely ready for it. The realization landed a half-second before my body did. I'd been on black market suppressants since I was 16. Cheap, industrial-grade pills built for omegas doing high-risk manual labor, the kind that didn't just mask your scent but buried your entire cycle under layers of chemical ice. You weren't supposed to stop them cold. If you did, the body panicked, and years of held-back hormones came due all at once. A cramp seized my lower abdomen, hard enough that I doubled over, gasping as the pain radiated down through my thighs. My vision swam, the kitchen dissolving into dark, smeared shapes. The room seemed to jump 10 degrees in a heartbeat. Kieran. Dominic's voice sounded like it was coming through water. Strong hands caught my shoulders as my knees gave out. Don't touch me, I choked, panic clawing up my throat. An alpha's touch during the onset of a heat was a match dropped into a powder keg. Their biology was built to overwhelm, to dominate, to consume completely, and I had spent my whole life avoiding exactly this scenario. Terrified of becoming a mindless thing steered by a gland in my neck, Dominic didn't argue. He let go instantly, both hands raised. I'm not touching you, he said, voice dropping into something low and deliberately soothing. The scent of burnt cedar lost every sharp edge, folding instead into something like a cool blanket. It was a controlled, precise manipulation of his own pheromones to keep me tethered to the ground. Breathe, you're safe, you are in my house, and nothing touches you without your permission. I slid down the cabinets to the floor, skin already on fire, sweat beading along my hairline. The scent of bruised blackberries filled the kitchen, thick enough to be dangerous, heavy enough to unmake a lesser alpha entirely. I looked up at Dominic. His jaw was locked so tight the muscle jumped, the veins standing out along his throat, his chest rising and falling in slow, forced breaths. He was a predator standing over something bleeding and choosing with everything he had to stay exactly where he was. It hurts, I gasped, curling into myself against the tile. I know. He pulled a phone from his pocket and hit a single button. Get the medical team to the East Wing now. IV fluids, fever reducers, a full dose of synthetic neutralizers. A pause, eyes locked on Lone. No alphas in the halls, clear the entire corridor. He hung up, shoved the phone away. Can you walk? I shook my head. The cramps were coming in waves now, fast enough to strip away every rational thought I had left. All I could focus on was the burning and the desperate, humiliating urge to crawl the 3 feet toward the source of cold, cedar-scented calm. All right, Dominic said. I'm going to pick you up. I'm going to carry you to your bed. I am not going to do anything else. Understood? I managed a weak nod. He moved without hesitation, scooping me up like I weighed nothing. The instant my body pressed against his chest, a broken sound escaped me that I didn't fully recognize as my own voice. His heat against my fever felt like the only stable thing left in the room. I buried my face in his neck and breathed him in like a drowning man finding air. His breath hitched, his arms tightening around me for one unguarded second before he forced the reaction back down. "Hold on," he rasped, and carried me out of the kitchen and up the grand staircase 2 steps at a time. The halls were empty. He'd cleared them exactly like he said he would. He shouldered my suite door open, crossed the room, and laid me down at the center of the bed. The cool sheets were a brief, shocking mercy against my burning skin. He stepped back immediately, putting a hard 5 feet between us, breathing heavy, hands balled into fists at his sides. "The doctor will be here inside 2 minutes," he said, his usual composure entirely gone. "He's a beta. He'll give you something to bring the fever down and stabilize the cycle. You'll sleep for the next 12 hours. I turned my head into the pillow, a sob tearing loose. The pain wrapped around my spine like wire. "Don't go," I begged, the words leaving me with no permission from my pride, which had burned up somewhere in the last 10 minutes. Dominic closed his eyes. Whatever war was happening behind them looked like it hurt. "I can't stay in this room, Kieran," he whispered, opening them again, black now, pupils blown wide with instinct. "If I stay while you smell like that, I will break my word to you. I won't start whatever this is by taking you while you're out of your mind on a chemical crash." A knock. "Enter," he barked, without looking away from me. An older man rushed in with a silver case, took one look at the bed, then at Dominic, and his eyes widened at the density of alpha pheromones still hanging in the air. "Fix him," Dominic ordered, and left without waiting for a response, the door clicking shut behind him with a terrible finality. The doctor worked fast, pulling a syringe from his kit, and as the needle went in and the cool numbness of the neutralizer spread through my veins, the only thing I could feel, over the fever, over the pain, was the devastating absence of the alpha who had walked away to keep his promise. Somewhere in the haze before the neutralizer pulled me all the way under, I found myself thinking about the version of tonight that could have happened at any other house in this city. A different alpha would have stayed. A different alpha would have told himself the contract made it fine, that a debt was a debt regardless of what state the omega paying it was in, and he would have believed his own justification completely by morning. I had grown up bracing for that version of the story. I had built my entire adult life, the hoodies, the suppressants, the flat unreadable voice, as armor against that exact door closing behind exactly that kind of man. It hadn't occurred to me, not once in 23 years, that the door might close because someone was protecting me from what was on the other side of it, rather than sealing me in with it. Julian had thrown me into a den of vipers, but as the dark finally pulled me under, I understood with total certainty that the king of the vipers was the only man I actually wanted to be bitten by. Thirst woke me, a deep, scraping dryness like I'd swallowed glass. I peeled my eyes open. The curtains were drawn tight against the daylight, the room steeped in a cool, artificial twilight. The fever's crushing heat was gone, replaced by a hollow exhaustion that had settled into my bones, my skull throbbing in slow, dull beats. "Take it slow." The voice came from my right. Dr. Eris sat in a leather armchair, reading something off a tablet, looking every bit the overworked physician he probably was. He set it down and poured water into a glass, helping me sit up enough to drink. It went down like a miracle. "Your body went through a localized trauma," he explained, not unkindly. "Industrial suppressants are basically poison, Kieran. You hit a wall at 80 miles an hour. I've flushed the worst of it out of your system, but you're going to feel like you lost a fight for the next 2 days. How long was I out? A day and a half. He checked my pulse, satisfied. Core temperature's stable. Scent glands have reset to baseline. You're no longer in active heat. That was a false spike from the chemical withdrawal, not a true cycle. A false spike. A humiliating, terrifying loss of control, and for nothing. But as the fog cleared from my head, the memory of the kitchen sharpened. The scent of cedar, the pain, and Dominic Voss walking out of the room when every other man in his position would have locked the door instead. "Is he here?" Dr. Eris packed away his tablet. "Mr. Voss has been working out of the library down the hall since yesterday morning. Hasn't slept. Told me to page him the second you opened your eyes." He tapped his earpiece, murmured something, and gave me a polite nod on his way out. "I'll send Martha up with broth. Don't try to stand yet." Less than 30 seconds later, the door opened again. Dominic looked rougher than I'd seen him. Jacket and tie gone, shirt unbuttoned at the collar and wrinkled, a dark shadow of stubble across his jaw. He didn't rush to the bed inside, keeping a deliberate distance, his eyes sweeping over me, The pallor, the shadows under my eyes, the exhausted slump of my shoulders. "You look terrible," he said. A weak laugh scraped out of me. "You really know how to charm an omega, don't you?" The corner of his mouth twitched, small, but it changed the entire hard landscape of his face. He crossed to the vacated armchair and sat, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. "I was prepared to have you moved to a hospital if the fever hadn't broken," he admitted. And for once his voice carried no command at all, just a man plainly worried. Eris said he had it under control. I don't like relying on assurances. "Why did you leave?" I asked. The question had been sitting like a stone in my chest since I'd woken up, and I wasn't going to dress it up in polite phrasing. "You bought me. The contract gave you the right. I was literally begging you to stay." His expression hardened, and the room seemed to drop a few degrees. "Because a contract is not consent," he said, clipped and precise. "And because you were out of your mind on a chemical crash. Taking you in that state wouldn't have made me your mate, Kieran. It would have made me a rapist with a piece of paper to justify it." He dragged a hand through his hair, frustrated. "I have done terrible things. I have dismantled rival packs. I have ordered violence without losing sleep over it. But I do not force omegas, and I will not prey on someone who was thrown at me like meat by his own family." I stared at him. 23 years of cynical armor suddenly felt useless in this room, brittle, unnecessary. My whole life, alphas had been exactly what the stereotypes promised, entitled, thinking with their glands. Dominic was a warlord, a monster to the entire city, and yet he had a moral spine, rigid and immovable, exactly where the world expected him to have none. "Thank you," I whispered. It felt hopelessly small for what he'd actually done, but it was all I had. His gaze softened. "Don't thank me for basic decency. We're setting a new baseline. No more suppressants, no more hiding. You exist in this house exactly as you are. If you need something, ask for it. If I do something you can't stand, tell me. Understood?" I pulled the duvet up to my chest, a strange, unfamiliar warmth blooming in my ribs that had nothing to do with fever. "Crystal." He didn't get up right away. He sat there a moment longer, elbows still on his knees, and something in his face shifted, like he was deciding whether a door was worth opening. "You've heard the story about my uncle," he said. It wasn't a question. I went still. "That you tore his throat out to take the syndicate. That's the version that travels." He turned his hands over, studying his own palms like they belonged to someone else. "The true version is uglier and less impressive. He beat my mother for 11 years, and the pack elders called it a private family matter. I was 20. I didn't have soldiers. I didn't have money. I had a kitchen knife and a door he'd forgotten to lock. It wasn't a coup. It wasn't ambition. It was the only version of the story where she got to live past 40. His jaw tightened. The city turned it into a legend because a legend is useful. It keeps men like Arthur in line without me having to lift a finger every week. I let them believe the worst version because the worst version protects people. I've just never particularly enjoyed being the villain in a story I didn't choose to write. I didn't know what to do with the sudden, unguarded honesty of it. So that's the only true thing I had. That's not the story anyone tells. "No," he agreed, standing, straightening his cuffs like the conversation had cost him something, and he needed his hands to do something ordinary. "But it's the one that's true, and you asked me not to lie to you. I intend to keep that particular promise longer than I keep most of my others." He left it there, and I let him, filing the story away next to everything else I was slowly learning didn't match the rumors. A monster who'd killed to save his mother, who walked out of a bedroom to protect a stranger's consent, who filed paperwork instead of gloating. Somewhere in those small, unglamorous corrections, the version of Dominic Voss the city had built out of fear was quietly being replaced by the version I was actually living with. 2 days later, my legs remembered how to hold my weight. Martha had hovered over me like a militant guardian angel, forcing bland, aggressively nutritious meals into me until color came back to my face. My scent had settled into a steady hum of blackberry and damp earth, no longer choking the air, but no longer hideable either, lingering on my clothes, in my hair. I stopped trying to hide it. The estate felt different now, the dread that had greeted me at the gate replaced by something cautious and unfamiliar, curiosity. I was allowed to move freely, always shadowed at a polite distance by a security detail I mostly forgot was there. On the 4th afternoon of my recovery, restlessness finally won, and I went looking for Dominic. I found him in his ground floor office, the mahogany doors partially open. I stopped in the hallway when I caught the low, sharp cadence of his voice. He wasn't alone. He tried to board a private charter to Geneva at 4 this morning, an unfamiliar voice reported. Pilot refused clearance when payment bounced. He's stranded at the terminal now. Made 12 calls to former associates. None of them are picking up. Good. The flat, absolute zero in Dominic's tone raised the hair on my arms. Cancel his apartment lease. Have the landlord invoke the morality clause over the gambling debts. Seize the accounts. Every remaining cent goes toward interest on the original balance. I leaned into the door, pushing it open a few more inches. Dominic sat behind the desk, a man in a charcoal suit standing opposite with a tablet in hand. Dominic caught the movement instantly, and the icy command in his expression evaporated the second his eyes landed on me. He gave the man a short nod. That's all. Marcus, keep him under surveillance. Don't intervene unless he tries to contact Kieran. Marcus bowed slightly to Dominic, gave me a respectful nod on his way out, and left. I stepped into the office. The air smelled of winter frost, but it warmed the moment I crossed the threshold. You're out of bed, Dominic said, setting down his pen. Martha threatened to spoon-feed me if I didn't get up and move, I said, dropping into one of the leather guest chairs. I figured I'd take my chances out here. He leaned back, studying me. You look better. The shadows under your eyes are gone. I heard you talking, I said, cutting straight to it. Small talk had never been a skill of mine. About Julian. He didn't flinch, didn't try to sugarcoat it. I told you his actions have consequences. He committed fraud against this syndicate. I'm dismantling his life, freezing his accounts, stranding him where he stands, removing every safety net he built off your labor and my money. I'm forcing him to live in the exact reality he tried to sell you into. Right now, he's finding out what it feels like to have no money, no protection, and no one left to bail him out. I thought I'd feel something. Guilt, maybe, or the old biological tug of a twin bond urging me to beg for mercy on his behalf. We'd shared a womb. We'd shared a childhood. I'd spent my entire adult life throwing myself between Julian and his own worst decisions. But sitting there, looking at the man who had technically bought me, I felt nothing for my brother but a flat, distant apathy. The bond was dead. Julian had severed it himself, the moment he locked the car doors and drove off into the fog. It occurred to me, watching Dominic's face for any sign that he expected me to argue, that I had spent 23 years mistaking a specific kind of exhaustion for love. Every time I'd covered for Julian, every ally to a landlord, every shift I'd picked up so he could make a mixer, every debt I'd quietly absorbed without asking where the money had actually gone. I'd told myself it was devotion. It had never once occurred to me that devotion was supposed to be able to travel in both directions, or that a bond worth keeping shouldn't leave one twin permanently smaller than the other. I wasn't smaller anymore. I hadn't fully decided yet what I was instead, but for the first time in my life the question didn't frighten me. Do whatever you want with him, I said quietly. He's not my problem anymore. Dominic studied my face for a long moment, searching for hesitation for a lie. He found none, and gave a slow, satisfied nod. He opened a drawer, pulled out the same leather-bound folder from that first night, and set it on the desk between us. The ledger on his debt is still an open matter, he said, his tone shifting into something more formal. But the contract regarding you is sitting right here. My chest went tight. I know, do you? He tapped the cover with one finger. Technically, this piece of paper is worthless. Julian Hale signed it in his own hand, offering himself as the collateral described inside. His scent, his disposition, his name on every line that matters. He never intended to honor a single word of it. By PAC law, a contract obtained through impersonation is void the moment the fraud is discovered. I could tear this up right now. He slid the folder across the desk until it sat at the edge, right in front of me. I'm not going to keep you here as a hostage. Kieran, if you want to walk out those gates, I'll have a car brought around. I'll set you up in a secure apartment in the city. You'll have a stipend, you'll be free, and you won't owe me a single cent. My breath caught. A real, tangible way out, no strings attached. Or, I asked, barely above a whisper. He stood, walked slowly around the desk, and stopped in front of my chair, but instead of looming, he knelt, bringing our eyes level. The sheer physical presence of him up close was overwhelming, but it didn't feel dangerous. It felt like an anchor. Or, he murmured, the scent of cedar wrapping around me like a wall between me and the rest of the world. You stay, not as a debt payment, not as collateral. You stay as Kieran. You let me court you properly. Let me prove that an alpha can offer protection instead of pain. He reached out, calloused fingers brushing the metal band still locked around my wrist. The clause about the mark, the end-of-month deadline, that dies with the rest of this contract. If it ever happens, it happens because you choose it, on your timeline, not because a piece of paper with your brother's signature on it told me I was owed a bite. I want the survivor. I want the man who scrubs floors at midnight. I want you. He pulled a small silver key from his pocket, fit it into the lock, and turned. With a sharp click, the band fell away, clattering against the floorboards. I looked down at the raw red ring it left behind on my skin, then back up at the terrifying, ruthless leader of a criminal empire, kneeling on the floor in front of me like it was nothing. I don't have anywhere else to be, I said, my voice betraying just a fraction of a tremor. A slow, genuinely unguarded smile broke across his face. Then you're exactly where you belong. Courtship, in the traditional pack sense, usually meant lavish gifts, aggressive posturing, suffocating shows of dominance, alphas buying things to prove they could provide, and baring teeth to prove they could protect. Dominic did none of it. No diamonds. No parading me in front of the syndicate to mark territory. What he gave me instead was quiet consistency. Meals stopped being solitary meals eaten under Martha's watchful eye. We started eating together. The first week, we sat at opposite ends of a table long enough to seat 20. By the second week, his chair had migrated to the center. By the third, he sat directly beside me. He learned that I couldn't stand the texture of caviar and would take burnt-end potatoes over anything fancier. I learned he despised digital reports, insisting on printing everything and correcting ledgers with a cheap red pen that leaked ink onto his fingers without fail. He didn't hide his world from me, and he didn't handle me like glass that might shatter against the realities of syndicate life. I gave him something too, though it took me longer to work up the nerve. 3 weeks in, I started leaving small, useless observations on his desk, the way he left ledgers on the kitchen island. A note about a supplier's shipment being 2 days late before his own people caught it. A warning that one of the night shift guards had been favoring his left knee for a week and would need to be rotated off perimeter duty before he did something careless with a weapon. Warehouse instincts, mostly. 12 years of watching how systems failed from the ground up had taught me to notice things men behind desks rarely did. Dominic never said much about it directly. He just started leaving me a second chair and then a second set of files, and eventually stopped calling it anything at all. It simply became something we did together, the way other couples might share a crossword. The first real snowfall came in mid-November, and I found Dominic standing on the balcony off his office at close to midnight, jacket abandoned somewhere inside, watching it come down over the gardens, like he had nowhere else in the world he needed to be. I brought out 2 mugs of the bitter black coffee he actually liked, the kind that would have stripped paint, and stood beside him without saying anything for a long while. "You don't strike me as a man who stops to look at snow," I finally said. "I'm not," he admitted, taking the mug from my hands, fingers brushing mine a beat longer than necessary. "I used to work through nights like this. Ledgers, retaliations, whatever the week demanded. I don't remember the last time I stood still long enough to notice the weather." He glanced at me sideways, something unguarded in it. "You're a bad influence, Kieran Hale." I told him that was the nicest thing anyone had ever accused me of, and he laughed, a real one, short and surprised out of him, like it had gotten past a guard that usually caught things like that before they reached his mouth. We stayed out there until the coffee went cold and my fingers had gone numb, and neither of us moved to go back inside first. One evening in late November, I was curled up on the leather sofa in his office with a paperback while he worked, the fire throwing long shadows across the shelves, when a knock interrupted the quiet. An older alpha let himself in before Dominic even granted permission. Heavy wool coat, thick file under one arm, a scent like old leather and stale cigar smoke. I recognized him from files scattered across Dominic's desk. Arthur, an underboss running the downtown docks. He stopped short when he spotted me on the sofa, lip curling in an instinctive sneer as my scent reached him. "Didn't realize we were conducting pack business in front of the help," he said, eyes dragging over my oversized sweater and wool socks. Old habits flared, warehouse instincts telling me to close my book and make myself scarce. An unmatched omega learned early to shrink when an aggressive alpha walked into a room. "Sit down, Kieran." Dominic's voice wasn't loud, but it carried an absolute lethal authority that froze me exactly where I was. He set his red pen down slowly and looked at Arthur, and the air in the room condensed into something heavy enough to ache in my lungs. "You will address him as Mr. Hale," Dominic said, eyes boring into his subordinate. "And if you refer to my mate as the help again, I will have your tongue removed and mailed to your wife. Am I understood?" Arthur went rigid, the color draining out of his weathered face, his cigar smoke scent souring instantly with fear. He dropped his chin, throat bared in a rapid, jerky show of submission. "Understood, Alpha. My apologies, Mr. Hale." Dominic held him pinned there for 3 more excruciating seconds before finally letting him go. "Leave the file on the table by the door and get out." Arthur did exactly that, all but fleeing the room. The heavy door clicked shut, leaving a ringing silence behind it. I sat frozen on the couch, watching the spike of pheromones in the air recede back into that steady, familiar scent of winter frost. Dominic picked his pen back up and returned to the paperwork as though nothing had happened. He didn't look at me for approval. He didn't puff out his chest for credit. He'd simply defended what he considered his and gone back to work. I uncurled from the couch, set the paper back down, and crossed the rug to stand beside his chair. He paused, glancing up. I didn't say anything. I just rested my hand on his shoulder. The first time I'd initiated contact since the fever broke. His muscles were dense, coiled tight under his shirt. He let out a long breath and leaned into my touch, tilting his head until his cheek rested against the back of my hand, eyes closing. For a moment, the ruthless boss disappeared entirely, and there was only a man quietly grateful for someone's hand on him. "You didn't have to threaten to mutilate him," I murmured, thumb brushing the stubble along his jaw. "I didn't threaten him," Dominic said softly, opening his eyes. "I stated a fact. You are not a secret, Kieran. You are not temporary. They will respect you, or they will be replaced." He reached up, wrapping his hand over mine, threading our fingers together, and the warmth of it melted away the last stubborn layer of my armor. I had spent my whole life bracing for the hit, always waiting for the betrayal, always certain my usefulness had an expiration date. But standing there in the firelight, feeling the unhurried beat of his heart under my palm, I realized, for maybe the first time in my life, that I was actually safe. Winter broke into a muddy, cold spring. 6 months had passed since I first walked through the Voss estate's iron gates. Outside, the world kept spinning, chaotic as ever. Inside those walls, we'd built something closer to a sanctuary. I knew about Julian, because Dominic never kept anything from me. The report simply sat on the kitchen island, mine to read or ignore. My twin had spent 3 months bouncing between cheap motels and the couches of friends who tired of his complaining fast. When the money ran out completely, he'd taken a job as a host at a mid-tier club downtown. He was alive. He was working. He was, more or less, living the exact life I'd lived for years. I felt no pity. The ledger was balanced. Somewhere, in those 6 months, without either of us formally deciding it, I'd stopped being a guest in Dominic's life and started being a fixture in it. I sat in on the parts of syndicate business he didn't bother clearing the room for anymore. I learned the names of the underbosses who mattered and the ones who were only pretending to. I learned that Martha had been with the Voss family since before Dominic's uncle, and that she was the only person on the estate who could tell him no and expect to still have a job in the morning. I even, on a handful of restless afternoons, found myself back in a kitchen, not scrubbing baseboards this time, but standing next to Martha, learning how she made the roasted potatoes Dominic liked, because it turned out I wanted to be able to give him something too, not just receive things from him. It wasn't courtship in the way the old pack traditions described it. It was smaller than that, and it added up to more. My own biology, though, was keeping a ledger of its own. Without the industrial suppressants poisoning my system, my body had reset on its natural rhythm. I could feel it coming for days, heightened sensitivity, a desperate craving for Dominic's scent, a restless hum under my skin. It wasn't the agonizing chemical crash of withdrawal this time. This was natural, a slow, rising tide, pulling me under with a warm, heavy gravity. It hit in earnest on a Tuesday night. Dominic was reading in bed, the lamp, casting warm light across the sheets. I'd spent the last hour pacing the length of the room, unable to settle, my heart hammering an uneven rhythm against my ribs. The air had gone thick, saturated with the scent of crushed blackberries and dark earth, nearly suffocating. Dominic hadn't turned a page in 20 minutes. His jaw was locked tight, his eyes gone fully black, pale gray swallowed whole by blown pupils. He gripped the spine of his book hard enough to whiten his knuckles, letting me set the pace, forcing his own instincts down until I was ready. I stopped pacing and stood at the foot of the bed, chest heaving. "Dominic." My voice came out ruined, breathy. He dropped the book to the floor without looking away from me, staying perfectly still, breathing heavy and measured. "Tell me what you want, Kieran," he said, voice a low vibration that sent heat straight through me. "I want you to stop waiting," I whispered, climbing onto the mattress, crawling toward him as it dipped under my weight. "I want you." His restraint broke. In a fraction of a second he had me, hands gripping my hips, pulling me flush against his chest hard enough to knock the breath out of me, a soft gasp escaping as I collided with solid muscle and heat. "Are you sure?" he asked, lips hovering just short of mine. One last chance offered, one final door left open. I didn't answer with words. I closed the distance myself, mouth crashing against his, the kiss messy and desperate and entirely consuming. Years of suppressed instinct roared up all at once, demanding an anchor. He tasted like dark coffee and something uniquely his own. He rolled us over, pinning me beneath him, his weight settling like something inevitable. Every touch was deliberate, not gentle but firm, possessive, mapping every inch of skin with calloused hands, and a look that stripped away every defense I had left standing. He pressed his mouth to the old scars on my hands, from years of manual labor, like they were something worth keeping, not hiding. The heat between us built until the rest of the world simply ceased to exist. Nothing left but skin, tangled sheets, and the collision of frost and blackberry in the air. When the breaking point finally arrived, he shifted his weight, burying his face against the crook of my neck, nose dragging along the sensitive skin over my scent gland. "Mine," he growled, low and raw against my throat. "Yes," I sobbed, arching into him, offering myself completely. "Yours, please?" His teeth broke skin. The pain was sharp and blinding for one instant, immediately chased by a rushing wave of absolute completeness. The bond snapped into place, heavy and permanent, a chain, but not the kind that restricts. The kind that ties a ship to harbor through a hurricane. It meant I could never be swept away again. I wrapped my arms around his shoulders, fingers digging into his back as the chemical rush of the bite flooded my veins, and he held me against his chest, his own breathing ragged as he weathered the surge alongside me. We stayed tangled together for hours in the quiet aftermath, my head against his chest, listening to the steady thud of his heart. I traced the line of his collarbone with my thumb, letting the full, overwhelming weight of the life I'd fallen into settle over me. My twin had sold me to a monster to save his own skin. He'd thought he was condemning me to a life of pain and servitude. He thought I'd break. But as Dominic pressed a slow kiss to the crown of my head and pulled the blankets up around me against the cold night air, I smiled into the dark. Julian never understood the first thing about monsters. He never knew that the most ruthless men are sometimes the only ones who understand exactly how to hold something fragile without breaking it. I was sold to clear a ledger. In the end, I was the only one who actually walked away with exactly what he needed. Somewhere downtown, in a rented room above a club that would never make him rich, Julian was probably telling some new acquaintance a version of this story where he was the one who'd made a sacrifice. He would never know the ending. He would never know that the brother he'd handed over at a set of iron gates had found, on the other side of them, the first home that had ever actually felt like one. I used to think that was a loss worth grieving, that some part of me would always ache for the twin bond he'd severed the moment he drove away. But lying there, with Dominic's heartbeat steady under my ear, I understood that grief had already finished its work months ago, quietly, without asking my permission, the same way everything else about this new life had arrived. There was nothing left to mourn, there was only this. The fire burned down to embers, the frost and cedar scent of the only alpha who had ever earned the right to call me his, and the quiet, settled certainty that I was finally, irreversibly, exactly where I belonged. 23 years of bracing for a door to close on me, and it turned out the only door that mattered had opened instead, and stayed that way. Thank you for staying with Kieran and Dominic's story to the end. If this slow burn, gritty, emotionally intense Omegaverse romance kept you hooked from start to finish, give it a like so the algorithm knows to send it further. Share this video with your friends who love a good mafia redemption arc. The slower and grittier the better. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next upload. It's your support that keeps these stories coming. Drop a comment and tell us your favorite moment between these two. We read every single one. If this story stirred something in you, tell us about it down in the comments. We genuinely read every single one, and we would love to know which moment hit you hardest. A like tells the algorithm to keep these stories coming, and subscribing means you will be here the next time we open a set of gates like this. Thank you for spending this time with us.